about student media, whether supported or censored. And go on to the next slide so you can see who's here. I'm Rosie Hunnum. I'm the Student Opportunities Coordinator at NUS. There's a lot of familiar names in the list who people I've met before. For those of you that I haven't met, hi. I look after student opportunities, which is clubs, societies, student volunteering, student media, and volunteering. And I'm joined by Collette. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Collette. I am a press officer here at NUS, so it's my job to kind of manage the relationship between us and between journalists, getting them to write stories about us and also sometimes trying to get them to not write stories about us. And I've also taken the role of managing some of our relationships with student media, seeing how we can better support them, and also I used to actually edit my student newspaper when I was at university, so it's also interesting for me to be on the other side of it now as well.
Yes, so that's us. If you haven't already introduced yourself, now's your chance. Tell us who you are, and we'll go on to the learning objectives. So what we're hoping that you'll get out of today, we hope that you'll understand why student media is essential to the student movement. I would guess that most of you already know that, but we'll kind of give you the NUS perception on that, talk around that topic. We're going to talk you through some policies and procedures that you should have in place that will help you support student media and avoid disputes. So one of the reasons that we're doing this webinar is because we've seen a rise in disputes, or not necessarily full disputes, but complications or situations where the student union and student media aren't getting along particularly well. So we'll talk to you about some things that you can do to avoid that happening in the first place and what to do when that happens. And we're going to talk about ways that you can build a good relationship with your student media and understand why this is important to the student union. So hopefully we'll cover those through our webinar. But first we're going to talk a little bit just around like the general student media landscape. So give you some context, because I understand that some of you will be very experienced in this and some of you may be quite new or haven't talked much about student media. So in unions, student media is structured quite differently. There's no set structure, and what we're doing as part of our work on student media, we're releasing a briefing document fairly soon, which will talk in more depth about student media. And in that, we've given 5 or 6 different examples of how student media is structured within a student union. And what you'll find when you read that is that actually, even where on the surface it looks quite similar, so perhaps you've got volunteers who are doing the writing or presenting on the radio, and then you've got maybe the editor. Actually, even if it looks really similar, within the different structures and how people are elected, etc., is quite different. So I think for those of you who say, we get asked a lot, like, what's the best way of structuring student media? We don't necessarily think there is one. So sorry, but there isn't. We're not going to tell you the best way to sort out your student media. We've seen recently of more merged student media. So where it may have been separate, you had a separate newspaper and a separate magazine, and then a radio and a TV that are all branded differently and aren't necessarily talking to each other that much. Over the past couple of years, particularly, I've been at NUS for 2 years, and particularly over the past year and a half, I've noticed that a lot of student unions are trying to merge their student media, bringing them all under a brand that's the same or similar, and getting them to talk to each other, be trained together, and that kind of thing. Luckily, in SUs, student media is by volunteers or has a large number of volunteers participating in it. So that's kind of a trend. It isn't just for media students. So something I talked to a union about the other day was that they only had media students working in their student media, and they thought that was the norm. Whereas actually, it's usually the other way around, that you've got who are really interested in media but aren't necessarily studying it as their main topic. And they may want to go into it in the future, but that's not what they're studying. So that's interesting. Normally, we don't censor or regulate student media, and there isn't a body that does that. we support student media, and at the end of the webinar, we will talk through lots of the different things that we do to support student media, so you'll be able to hear about that. There are also some media associations, which we'll then go into more detail at the end of this webinar, but they, again, don't censor or regulate student media. They're there to support. And the National Union of Journalists. So whether you wanted to just mention about the Code of Conduct?
The NUJ is the trade union for journalists, and they mostly deal with issues or disputes, but they do have a student branch that students can join as, I think they get discounted membership, which is about £25. And NUJ's Code of Conduct is something that they give all of their members and would ideally like all journalists to follow. And it just talks about how you can be ethically and how you should operate with honesty and integrity. It's on their website, which we can actually link you to. But they also advise that all student journalists adhere to this code as well.
Yeah, and the briefing that we're going to be releasing, we talk in more detail about that and how you can be more involved with that. So just a kind of an overview of what is going on with student media at the moment. Talk to you about why NUS champions student media. So Collette's going to talk to you about that.
Yeah, we think that student media is really important. We think it's a central part of the student movement. It provides fantastic opportunities for students to gain new experiences and to develop their skills. So if students entertained, it provides key information about what's going on around them and on their campuses, in the towns that they live in, and across the student movement more widely. Everyone should be really proud of that. It also plays a key democratic function, so it holds university and college students' unions and their institutions, and also NUS to account. It raises awareness about what you and what we do, and it also supports the democratic functions of those organisations. So people are to exercise their democratic rights to vote for a governing body or for their student leadership. They need to be informed, but it's also important to remember that democracy isn't just about voting, and democracy actually works best when people are aware of what's going on and when there are good opportunities to hold those in power to account for lobbying or campaigning to influence the decisions they make. Media outlet will also play a key role in raising awareness of colleges and universities or student unions and also NUS what we're doing, whether that's good or bad. So I think that's really important to remember. And lastly, student media is an incredible opportunity for students to learn new skills, and it looks excellent on their CV. It's so important at a time when the job market is incredibly competitive for students. Student journalists of today are the national journalists of tomorrow. I mean, you've got people like Ollie Duff, who is the editor of The Eye, Ed Davis, who now presents Newsnight, or Andrew Gilligan, who's an editor of The Telegraph. They all edited their student media outlets when they were at university, and now they're really renowned for what they do in the industry, so that's really important.
And they're very linked up with NUS. We spend quite a lot of time with them. They support a lot of our media work, so that's really nice that they get involved as they understand what student media is.
Yeah.
So that's student media. And that's given you some interesting context to think about and how to explain why we're doing this webinar today, because it's really important and it's something that we take very seriously. So moving on to kind of the main stuff in the webinar. One of the things that we're going to be talking about is censorship. The title of the webinar was Supported or Censored. So we're going to talk about censorship and whether or not it's a growing problem. A lot of student unions talk to us about this. It's something that previously, when we've tried to address, we haven't necessarily had an answer. So in the work that we've been doing recently around student media, we've explored this issue with the leadership of the US, so the president and vice presidents, and we've talked to a lot of different people about this. And so this gives you some idea of where we're coming with this stuff. So,
yes, when we speak to media and student journalists, censorship appears to be the #1 problem for them at the moment. So we hold a student media summit, which I'll talk to you in more detail a bit later on. We hold it every August, and last year there was a session run by the Student Publications Association, and it was all about student media, what the kind of growing problems or what's going on. It's just a space to share best practice. And there was growing consensus in the room, and I think there were about 60 student journalists there at the time who said that censorship was becoming a big issue for them. So we heard stories of journalists who felt their writing had been censored, particularly if they write a story, what would be a negative but a completely legitimate story about their students' union. Student journalists felt that university and union staff almost kind of took advantage of their vulnerability as developing new journalists by sometimes being heavy-handed or feeling they could kind of strong-arm them into not writing certain things. It's not just students' unions either. Universities have also been involved sometimes if the story has appeared in a media outlet is about them. So on the screen, there was a story in The Guardian late last year that had been picked up about freedom of the press, not for student newspapers. And the girl, you can just see the floating head of there, Katie, it was picked up when she was actually threatened with expulsion from her institution for writing a story about some cuts that the institution was going to make to student support. So it was very much a factual story, but the university was incredibly angry about it. And she also gave some other examples of where she'd also written legitimate stories, and she had actually been told that what she was writing was completely false and they lie, but it was actually later picked up by local national journalists, so she just felt that was a bit unfair. On the other hand, though, we know that students' unions have a tough job, particularly when it comes to things like slander and defamation, which we'll talk to you a little bit more about later. But from student journalists, it certainly seems like this is definitely a growing problem.
Yeah. And then we've talked to students' unions. So in preparing for this webinar and writing the briefing document, we had some focus groups with some student unions, and we've kind of summarised the key things that they've said on the slide that you can see now. So as I have said, that they recognise that in most cases student newspapers won't ever have full freedom because of the relationship within their student union. The media is becoming more risky, and linked to that is the next point, that we're seeing an increase in number of problems with defamation cases. And as I said, we're going to talk to you a little bit more about that in some of the following slides. So, and that's one of the reasons why we're looking at this now. But on kind of the other side, perhaps student media is really important, and student unions really do want it as part of their student union, and even is risky, and that there's problems want it to be involved. So that's good. So position on censorship.
I just think it's important to preface this that as with all of NUS policy, we totally obviously recognise that all students' unions govern themselves and are autonomous, and that our views or policy is binding on any of our member unions. Ultimately, our general view is that we would like student media to stay as part of the students' union, because I think it is important to have a certain amount of control there, because otherwise you get things like the tabs bringing up where you just have absolutely no control because they're private owned and privately governed. But where it is possible, we would like student media outlets to have as much autonomy as they possibly can as well, because like I said, we do think that student media is a central part of the student movement. It acts to keep students informed and entertained, and it provides that key information regardless of the media format or platform about what's going on their campus. As I mentioned before, it does play that key democratic function, and I do think that it is there to also hold the university, the college or the students' union, and also NUS to account. I mean, there have been countless times when student media outlets have called me a quote about a negative story, and I've assisted them with that. And national media outlets are seen as the fourth pillar of society, and also crucial to inform society and democracy. We think that student media outlets are also the fourth pillar of the student movement, and that a high quality and engaged student media outlet makes the student movement stronger.
If you have any questions, you're welcome to add those in the chat bar, and if we can't cover them now as we're talking, we'll cover them at the end, or if we can't answer them, then we'll email an answer to you later on. So we've talked to you about censorship, and we've recognised that it's a growing problem in students' unions. One of the reasons we're doing this webinar is because we've had a number of students' unions talk to us about this problem. We also developed our link with the Student Publications Association, who represents student publications across the UK, and they recognise it as a problem as well. But it's not a problem that we think is unsolvable, and we think that there's some really good ways that you can start to work on this and develop the relationship between your student media. And we really think that's important. So when we outlined why we think student media is important, we really think it's important that we support you in developing these relationships and helping you to make your student media grow and flourish. So what we talk about now is some areas that you can think about that help you to support your student media. It's kind of in 3 parts. The first is developing policy procedures. So to kind of avoid things happening in the first place, ensuring expectations are clear and ensuring that you've got the right legal foundations and that you've got the right policies in place and that the procedures you have are agreed between yourself and as an SU and your student media. So first, and we'll talk about that in a moment. A good relationship's really important. Makes it easier to discuss tricky issues. If you've got mutual respect, it's really helpful. Then we'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, the third, which again we'll go on to talk about, is developing the people involved, and that could be your student journalists, that could be the staff that are working in unions, it could be you, and also in terms of other people, it could be your sabbatical officers. So ensuring that people have the right skills, knowledge and experience to deal with issues and to work on these problems. So with those 3 areas in turn and talk about what you might be able to do, and don't panic about writing everything down because we can do the slides afterwards, and you also can have this recorded, and then the briefing document goes over all of this stuff in more detail. So when we get the briefing out to you, you'll get this in more detail. So don't panic about writing everything down that we say, because there's quite a lot of stuff coming up. So first, in terms of dealing with disputes and making that relationship better, policies and procedures are really important. The first thing that we've seen in student unions where they've got a pretty good relationship with their student media and they are confident in managing that relationship and managing problems and disputes is that they have an agreement. This could be that it's called a memorandum of understanding, it could be an expectations document, you can call it whatever you like, but it will depend on what fits with your SU, and that could be an actual policy or it could be that it's an agreement outside of your official policy agreement. Kind of stuff that you should cover within that, we've on the slide. So funding, how much funding do your media receive from the student union, if any? What's the money for? When will it be reviewed? Are there limits or regulations to this funding? We see that this is a really important thing to clarify because lots of issues come up where you will write something that the union don't agree with, and then the union may say, well, if you write that, we aren't going to fund you anymore, or we're going to not pay for that thing that we said we'd pay for. So outlining expectations around funding and what the limitations are to that is really important, and having that down and agreed by both parties. Editorial control. How much, if any, editorial control does the student union have over student media? And who that holds this editorial control, and encourage you when you're writing this procedure to have that written down. It doesn't have to necessarily be the person, but which role is responsible for that. So if you're the student activities manager, naming that agreement that the student activities manager will have X amount of control over what's and we need to be really careful about that and making sure that it's to be able to make those decisions. In terms of editorial control, thinking what the process is for approving articles, who's to see it before it goes out, making sure that is realistic in terms of timescales. What I think about is what relationship does student media have with the university? So are there an expectation that when the paper writes something about the university, you send it to the press office and ask for comment? That should be written down in some way and agreed between the parties. as I mentioned before, we're going to talk about this stuff in more detail in the briefing, so we'll explain ways in which you can do this in the briefing. The conduct and behaviour. So what do you have a code of conduct or ethical standards that volunteers should abide by? We mentioned earlier the NUJ code of conduct, and we recommend that. That's really good, and it's been tested and it's been used for a really long time. So that would be a good place to start. The thing about behaviour, is there a particular behaviour that you expect from all of your volunteers, not just your student media? And what happens if that behaviour is don't follow that code of conduct or behaviour? Complaints and disputes. So if you have a complaints procedure, that needs to be outlined really clearly. We'd encourage you to have a complaints procedure. Who to and how is this managed? So if you have an online place for your student media, it's down there somewhere that if someone has a problem with an article or something has been said that they don't agree with, how do they complain, and making sure that's transparent. On disputes, and we'll into this in a little bit more detail. How are disputes between SU and student media managed? Is there a way that you against this and making sure that that disputes procedure is agreed? And anything that we've written, we outline quite a clear example of how you can manage those disputes. I've just written editorial procedure as a bullet because I think that bit's the most important part to get right. So that the stuff around who is in charge, who has editorial control. Talk a little bit more over the next slides about who it should be and what training and stuff they should have. Is there anything to add to that slide? No. No? Cool. As I said before, any questions, please ask. So this slide, there's loads on this slide, but this has come from Ensley. So we've worked with Ensley Insurance because when we were talking about this area of work, we worked with them as they've had an increase in defamation cases against the Students' Union. So it's really important to talk about this. So you'll see this is Ensley's definition of defamation. So defamation is any intentional false communication, either written or spoken, that harms a person's reputation, decreases the respect, regard or confidence in which a person is held, or induces disparaging, hostile or disagreeable opinions or feelings against a person. Isn't it? Kind of the context that we're talking about. So defamation in written form is known as libel, and a spoken statement is known as slander. So if one of our student media outlets were to write something that was defamatory, it would be libel, and if they were to say on the radio, for example, or on your TV, something defamatory, that would be slander. So it's just to clarify that thing. So within your editorial process, there should be an action plan to follow in circumstances where a piece of writing or broadcast media has been identified as potentially defamatory. Include when material should be referred to lawyers or an independent journalist. And something that we encourage in the briefing that we've produced is that as Students' Union, you have somebody who is expert in this, whether that's a lawyer or a very experienced journalist, so that anything where you are concerned that it may be defamatory, you can refer it on to an expert, because we recognise that although you as Students' Union staff are very knowledgeable in how your student media works, you may or may not be an expert in defamation. Ensley also advise in terms of protecting yourself from being sued, that think about the correct insurances, so and who is responsible for that. So they've said that even if your student media is part of your Students' Union, it will be covered by your student union insurance policy. What this is that if your newspaper, for example, writes something that's defamatory and it's taken to court, it probably won't be your student media who is standing up in court defending itself. It will be your trustee board or your chief executive, because they hold the ultimate responsibility for Students' Union. So this is why we're concerned with this, because it will be your Students' Union that has to kind of take responsibility. To avoid to protect yourself from being sued, the stuff I just talked about on the previous slide around having those policies and procedures in place are really important. And Ensley always emphasize when they're talking about protecting yourself from being sued is to have written evidence that you've done everything you can to control the situation from going in the first place. So when you're talking about your procedures and policies, making sure that the responsibility is outlined in those procedures and policies, and your process for managing sensitive or risky stories is outlined in that policy, so that if you position where you're talking about court cases and defence, you're able to say, well, the process we have for editorial is this, and that's how we manage sensitive stories being published. Again, it's about reporting complaints and issues that's in your procedure, so that if you do get to a position where you're facing a defamation case, you can say, well, we do a reporting procedure to avoid this from happening, and so that we can manage it appropriately. And then the final point on the slides, which is important that Ensley emphasise, is that the appropriate training is given to those people responsible, and we'll talk about that in a moment about who that might be. But again, when you're training people, something that Ensley emphasises that the training is recorded. So it's no good if you get to a position where you're standing up in court and can say, well, I'm the person that's in charge of this editorial process, and I'm appropriately in media law, but that isn't written down and recorded, then that's difficult to defend. So we recommend that if you do have training in place, or if you yourself are trained, then that's recorded so that you can evidence it. So quite complicated. What I've done here is just given you an overview of how to protect yourself from being sued. When we produce the briefing, that's in more detail in there, and Ensley have gone into more detail, but we can't cover that in as much detail as we'd like you today because we've only got just under an hour. So hopefully that gives you an overview which will help you to start thinking about that stuff. So supporting quality in student media is also about the relationship between your student media and your students' union. So Collette, do you want to talk about it in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so building relationships between journalists and whoever it is that they're writing a story about is absolutely key. So we've got examples of NUS and press and government and press here on the screen. Generally, any press officer or someone working in PR, building relationships with journalists is probably the most important thing that you can do. So what we do at NUS, for example, we've got a really good relationship with the Guardian students, journalists who write for them, and we meet with them and all of our other key contacts, but for particularly them every July. So it's just when the new officers come into office, and we see what their key priorities for the year are. So we'll meet with the journalists to let them know who the elected officers are, what their priorities are, what work we've got coming up, and see how it marries in with the stuff that they would like to write about. And it just means that you just keep that kind of face-to-face contact, and it's just really good even when they come to you with a story that you particularly wouldn't like them to write about you. They're not going to be physics and student media is very cyclical in that.
Oh, seems to have gone. Can you okay?
Oh,
that's strange. It didn't look like anything was happening this end, but sorry about that. We're on, and hopefully you'll be able to hear. We'll close to the microphone, and hopefully that will help.
Yeah. Do shout if it goes again. So what I was saying is that we recommend that all either the chief exec or your leadership, so your president or whoever is responsible for dealing with student media, have an initial meeting at the very beginning of the academic year, particularly because student media is cyclical. So as people leave, the journalists will change, or people may drop out because they've got too much going on or whatever. Having that meeting is really important, an excellent opportunity to lay your expectations or your boundaries. So I think that, it's your view that student media cannot be fully independent or autonomous because they are funded by you. That's an excellent opportunity to lay that out, because then at least they will know that that is the case. It potentially leads to a drop in disputes. And also, it means that they just can't say, well, I didn't know that was the case, because you set that out to them. When I was on my student newspaper, I had absolutely no idea that the union even funded it. That might sound really silly, but if you're a new journalist, you're not going to understand how any of that works. So just explaining the procedures and all of the expectations of that initial meeting is really important. Follow up, I would suggest having meetings at least once a term, if not more regularly, just to keep up that face-to-face relationship. And what you can do to support them, are you sending them your press releases? If you're not, student journalists, because there's so much going on in the rest of their lives at university, are basically scrabbling around for stories a lot of the time. So if you've got really good stories, send them to them, and then there's less space to write about the bad ones. And what you can do to support them in other ways as well. So can you give them some training? What we've heard from students' unions is that training is really, really important. And if journalists are trained properly, then that means that they're less likely to write stories that they shouldn't be writing, as in terms of defamation, so because they know exactly what the legal terms are and what those boundaries are. Can you invite them to events? Can you get them into events to interview people? Can you give them exclusives? Can you potentially set up a NUJ chapel in your institution or union? So what that is it's basically, it's kind of would be setting up a mini trade union for the student journalists in your union. It's usually free. It used to be, at least when I was at university, so double check that. But they get a representative in, and it means they get a local contact with a local journalist as well, which is also going to be beneficial for unions. And it will just give them a place to iron out any issues on us as well, which is excellent.
Yeah. So can I start talking there about the training and development, and we're going to talk about now. So developing your people is really important, and that's not just the people who are involved in student media, but also your sabbatical officers and the staff, and that may be you. But making sure that you've got the right skills, the right knowledge, and the right experience to be dealing with student media and to be supporting student media, and also for your volunteers, so that they're well trained. As Collette says, they're not kind of blindly doing the wrong thing, and there's more of a likelihood that if they've done something wrong, they've done something wrong rather than accidentally doing it. So training may be in-house. It may be that the stuff that you do that they need skills development. It may be that they've got quite technical needs that they need beating, and is that something that you can do in-house, or something that you need to seek externally? Another thing to think about in the training is, how do they understand how the Students' Union works? Do they understand who the people are and what they do, what the role of officers is, and who the officers are accountable to? So it's not really basic stuff, but that can really help in terms of supporting quality in your student media, like making sure they understand how everything works. Again, with your university or college, so who is it that they would need to be talking to? Who would be a great person for them to interview about a topic? Giving that information so that the quality of the stuff that they produce is improving. Again, in terms of knowledge, making sure that any policies that you have within your SU that relate to them, they at least know about and have had a chance to look at, and getting them to do that, so that if they are breaking a volunteer policy, for example, they know about it. Externally, there's lots of different training available. There's stuff that we do at NUS, which we're going to go on to talk to you in a moment. There's also media law training available, and NCTJ. Do you want to just explain to them what that is?
Yeah, the NCTJ is the National Council for Trained Journalists, and essentially if you want to work on a national or a local newspaper, you have to be qualified, or you have to have it's called having your NCTJ, but it's basically having a certificate in various elements that you have to be trained in before you can become a journalist, so shorthand, media law, ethics, for example. There is a student course that you can do, and I think that they might get a discounted rate, but what some unions have done is looked at seeing if they can implement that within their union, or if they can get like a bulk deal to train a lot of journalists in a group. So that's just another avenue that you can explore.
Yeah, something that a couple of unions have talked about is joining up with other local unions in your region and then approaching NCTJ saying, well, rather than having 5 journalists to train, we've actually got 30, and so can you give us the discount rate to come into one of the unions to do that? We are looking at sourcing through NUS, but it's quite early stages, so that's something that we would like to do in the future, but we haven't got that available to you at the moment. So
to clarify, the training that we would be looking at implementing isn't the one that enables them to become a qualified local and national journalist. It would be a workshop on an element of journalism, so it might be about media law, for example.
Yeah. So it's really important that the people who are working within your media or linked to your student media have the right skills, knowledge and experience to do their jobs properly. And that will help in terms of dispute management and problem management. If you have then got that as a backdrop, you know that people are trained appropriately, and it will avoid the disputes. So we're coming to the end now, but what we wanted to talk to you about right at the end was just some of the stuff that we currently do for student media, because I understand that we're not always brilliant at telling you about everything that we do. So Colette's just going to run through our own offering with student media, and then we've got time at the end for you to ask any questions. So have a think about those.
Yeah, so there's a lot that we do for student media at the moment. One of the things that we set up in January 2014, I believe, was the NUS Journalist Scheme. And what we did is we hired 8 student journalists who were students from around the country at both E and HE to write monthly articles for our website, and we paid them. We also paid for their NUJ membership, and we got them kind of exclusive interviews and events to go to. So, for example, some of the stuff that is on our website are interviews with movie stars, because we've got the extra deals, and we sometimes get them, well, we did get them to interview some cool people. So it just helps them develop their skills. That ran for a year and was very successful, and we've modified a little bit recently because we decided to hire 3 specifically for the general election to talk about the 3 themes of our general election campaign, which are education, community and work. And their contracts are due to run out just in June, just after the election. We will be looking to do is to renew the scheme and also see if we can branch it out into creating video content and more broadcast content for our website as well. So I would encourage you to let your student journalists know that we do that, and to keep your eyes peeled on the NUS website for when the new scheme will be advertised.
We also talk about this kind of stuff on the student media Just mail.
Yeah, that's right. We've got the Student Media Summit as well. So the Student Media Summit is a really excellent event. It's usually 2 days in August, and in conjunction with Amnesty International. And we invite from all journalism, so broadcast, radio, print, comment, sports journalists, anyone you can think of, to both speak and also hold practical workshops with journalists over the 2 days. So it's in London. It's at Amnesty International HQ. Last year was amazing. We had Stacey Dooley do a keynote. We had Evan Davis from New York just after he got announced. We actually booked him before we knew he was announced to be the new Jeremy Paxman, but that was brilliant because we got him just before he started to work on Newsnight. Owen Jones did a keynote. We have loads of people from magazines like Grazia and Marie Claire do really practical sub-editing workshops. We've got people for journalism, and what is really good is that because it's actually considering it's quite small, you usually get about 60 to 100 student journalists attend, and they can actually meet the journalists and interview them afterwards. So it's just really, really good one-on-one contact that they can get with them, and it also helps to produce content for student media outlets as well.
And it's really cheap, isn't it?
It's really cheap. It's only £5 to attend. Unfortunately, we don't provide common travel. We do provide food, and it's just £5 to register. So I would encourage everyone to let their students know about that event. This year, it's again being held at Amnesty International on I believe the 20th and the 21st of August. So we'll be advertising that widely anyway. But just let put that date in your diaries. We also have recently struck up a new partnership with Unreported World. That is a human rights documentary program that's on Channel 4. And last year we held the first event with them for headquarters, which is really cool, so that when students go, it's this amazing building that they just can't believe. It's just brilliant. And it's a half-day workshop with the presenters of Unreported World, and again, it's very practical. They break out into little sessions and are taught very practical things by people who have been doing that job for a really long time, and a lot because they're sent to kind of countries in conflict and with really awful humanitarian crises. They show the really excellent stories that people can listen to and learn from. So we're hoping to renew that partnership again and to hold more events like that, because it's really great and hands-on for student media journalists. We also help people with statements and interviews with NUS officers and about things that we're doing. So I don't tend to post our press releases onto the student media JISC because there would just be JISC going around everywhere. But what we have is we have a student media email list, and if they sign up to that, then they will get all of the press releases that we send. If they aren't signed up to that, I would recommend that they do. And we do give them interviews, whether that's by the phone or face-to-face with our officers. That's a good practice for them, which is great. And then we've also got some national media associations, which I'll let Rosie talk to you about.
Yeah, so we have relationships with the Student Publications Association, the Student Radio Association, and the National Student Television Association, and their acronyms are there for you if you need them. SPA, SRA, NASTA. So we're working with them to support them because we recognise that it's better that they, as students and representatives of students, are supporting their individual student journalists than us necessarily, because they know a lot more about the specifics of student radio or what it's needed for student TV to work properly. So we found that it's much better for us to work with them and through them to support the specific kind of technical stuff and supporting with their conferences. And so if you're not already kind of hooked up with them, we'd encourage you to check them out and encourage student media to link up with them. And they do awards every year, which are really cool. And each of them run a conference that your student journalists can go to. So we just basically encourage you to, if you're not already linked up with them, to check them out. And we can also, if they have any opportunities, we also help to promote those. That's pretty much it. I'm sorry if there's been sound problems for you. That's not ideal. Hopefully it hasn't ruined your experience too much. But if you have any questions, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes now. If you've got any questions about anything we've talked about, we can answer those for you. On the slide, you'll see pressoffice@nus.org.uk. That's the email address that Collette looks after. So if any of your journalists want a quote or they want an interview, that's the email address for that. Or if you have any kind of specific stuff around press or the more technical areas, then that's the email address to go to. If you have questions about kind of how we're supporting student media or anything to do with the One Student Opportunities Brief, then my email address is on there as well. Feel free to contact us.
If James has just written in the chat bar that he'd be interested in joining the press release list, if you want to get your student media outlet signed up to that, or if you would like to be signed up to that, if you could just drop your email addresses to the press office email address, and I will put you onto the list.
Cool. In terms of follow-up resources, while you're all thinking of hundreds of questions for us, as we've mentioned a few times, we've got quite a thorough briefing document that we're just finalising at the moment. We're working on that with the Student Publications Association because it is largely about print media, but we're also working with the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, and we're just waiting for them to sign it off, and then it will be finished. So we're hoping to get that out fairly soon, and that will in more detail about the defamation stuff that we've mentioned. And we have in a section in there about defamation and protecting yourself from being sued. We also outline in there what being included in your student media policy or procedures. We also outline an idea for how you deal with disputes between yourself and Students' Union and with your student media. So that would be a really helpful document that we're going to be releasing very soon. And this is more of kind of the start of our student media stuff, so we're hoping that there will be more stuff coming out after that too. So if there's anything that you specifically have a problem on, please get in touch with either Press Office or myself, and we will look into how we can support you with that. Does anybody have any questions? Info about the mailing list, my sound went funny. Yeah, we'll just repeat that.
Yeah, so if either you or if you want to get your student media outlets sign up to the press release mailing list, then if you could just drop your email address in an email to me at the press office at us.org.uk email address, I'll pick all of those up and then I can add the remaining names to the press release list. The thing with the press release list is that because some people don't have kind of generic editors at studioutlet.com email addresses, they use their personal ones. When they leave, it doesn't really get updated very well, so we kind of rely on you guys to let us know when you've got people in your student newspapers or radio stations or television stations. We can carry on updating our list.
As to what extent is it the student union's responsibility to make students aware about the risks of associating with publications such as the university paper or the tab? Should allow these on campus or is it a form censoring? We have a policy on whether they should be allowed on campus or not.
No, and I know that it's a topic of debate amongst unions at the moment. I mean, in terms of, I think that I can really advise on is how we personally treat them, and we treat them the same as we do any kind of media outlet, whether that's student media or national media. The thing with TAB is that national media looks at their stories a lot, and national media actually get a lot of stories, particularly about campuses or unions, from the TAB because they're on the pulse quite a lot. I think they're to find out about the TAB anyway, but I think that it's important to just let them know what the difference between the union paper and the TAB is. I mean, we have to remember that the TAB is often very sensationalist. It has its issues in that. I think that it's important to outline that it's the individual journalist who would be ultimately responsible for anything that goes wrong at the TAB. I don't know how they work inside because I haven't ever worked for them. I don't know anyone that has particularly worked for them and hasn't been able to give us that kind of advice. But I think it's just I think because inform them of the risks that come with it and then let them make their own decision.
And I think if one of the best things you can do is champion your student media and make your student media stronger, because the stronger they are and the better they are, there's less of a need for these other bodies. Yeah. We've got a couple of minutes if anybody has any other questions. That was a really good question. Thanks, James. If you but when you're sat doing something this afternoon or in the next week or so, you've got a question for us, you can email either Press Office or Rosie and we will try and answer for you. If you haven't got any more questions, we'll finish now. If you signed up to this, we will send you the briefing when we have it. The recording is uploaded onto our webinar YouTube channel. We will send you the recording link so that you can listen to this again if you need to. You can have your student media if you want, that's absolutely fine. Please feel free to do that, but we'll make sure that you get that email to you when it's ready. So if nobody has any further questions, I think we'll finish up there, and thanks for participating. Oh, does the briefing document go to the merits and issues of having a sabbatical take the role? No, it doesn't. We talk a little bit about structures for student media. we don't advocate for one over another. We think it's very individual, down to your union, because like with societies or sports, they are all governed differently. There are similarities across different student unions, but it's not the same. And your funding is different and your staffing is different. So, we don't talk about whether it's good or bad to have a sabbatical take the role of editor-in-chief. Sorry. Take it as a no. We'll finish up there. Thank you so much for participating, and we hope it was helpful. And please be in touch if you have any further questions.
Thanks everyone. Bye.